if public opinion is to be changed, it must be done through some sort of dramatic step on the other side. And if King Hussein doesn't have the courage to do that, and the Palestinians do not have the courage to do that, it's going to be a great tragedy for all people concerned. It's going to be a great tragedy for the Middle East, but above all for themselves.
Amnon Rubenstein is a member of the Israeli Knesset. He is a prominent lawyer and leading civil libertarian. I'm Stanley Rosenblatt. I interviewed Mr. Rubenstein at his office in Jerusalem last December. He is a liberal whose views are close to those of Labor Party leader Shimon Peres, who is the favorite to become prime minister in this July's election. Rubenstein is very proud of the Israeli record on Arab rights, the right to vote, to serve in the Knesset, and as judges. It's true, there are Arab legislators and judges in Israel. Likewise, he is pleased that the State of Israel spends public funds for Arab development and education. This is precisely why he is against annexation of the West Bank, with its approximately 1 million Palestinians, and why he favors a freeze on Jewish settlements there. He realizes that giving West Bank Palestinians the right to vote would be the most destructive thing that could happen to Israel, since they could then take over the country by democratic means. Rabbi Meir Kahane and other extreme rightists would like to annex the West Bank and deny its inhabitants the ballot. Although Rubenstein disagrees with fundamental positions of the Begin Shamir government, he blames the lack of peace on the adamant refusal of the Arab world to come to terms with an Israel of any size. Considering himself a realist, he says Lebanon can never be a unified sovereign state, and the only answer to the dilemma there must be some kind of partition formula. People who look at the situation objectively see the mass slaughter going on between the PLO elements within the Muslim community, Sunni, Shiite, Druze, and they really think there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy in all the governmental statements talking about the installation eventually of a strong central democratic government in Lebanon. And they feel there's never going to be that kind of government in Lebanon absent the United States or some great power or Israel really taking a major role in the process. And they ask, so what would be so terrible about partition, especially in view of what you just said about Israel's interest in Lebanon really being relatively limited to protect its northern borders? So therefore, if Israel had or controlled southern Lebanon and Syria controlled the part of Lebanon that's it's interested in, what would be so terrible about that?
You know, there are two meanings of partitioning of Lebanon. One is this de facto partition between Israel and Syria, which I would object to, because that would perpetuate Israel's presence in southern Lebanon, and that would mean a growing conflict with the local Muslim Shiite population, and quite frankly, we don't need that. We have got enough headaches as it is without adding this conflict with the southern Lebanese. That I would object to, but another concept of partitioning Lebanon is something which I would agree with. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, it's impossible to maintain this unitary Lebanon and to dream of this ordinary state with a central regime. And I would opt for some sort of partitioning between the Druze, the Muslim, and the Christian areas of Lebanon. Provide some sort of autonomy or even separate states, united by some sort of confederation. It's futile to expect Lebanon to live as one state after They've been fighting each other through these fratricidal wars. And I think partition, though not an ideal position, is preferable to the present state of affairs.
Although certainly the United States is not talking about that. So what do you actually see happening in practice?
Well, I would like the United States and the West to advocate the partitioning of Lebanon, and I would like the West, NATO, to take a greater interest in what happens in Lebanon, because looming above everything else is this Soviet PLO menace over Lebanon. And I'm sure that most Lebanese, and I don't have to take a public opinion poll for that, most Lebanese want to be free of a Soviet PLO domination. After all, the PLO has done terrible things in southern Lebanon. They've run their terrorist states of their own, and their regime has been characterized by atrocities, by rape and murder. And I'm sure most Lebanese want to be free of that forcible tutelage. And here it's the responsibility of America and NATO and its European allies to ensure some sort of a Lebanese modus vivendi without the Soviet menace. And the best way that I can think of is to divide Lebanon according to its warring sects, and to provide some sort of cooperation between these 2 or 3 autonomous zones which are so ethnically different from each other.
During the Iranian hostage crisis, where the Iranians held Americans for over a year, and when finally we got the hostages back when President Reagan went into power, America really never made Iran pay the price for that. When the American embassy in Beirut was bombed in April of 1983, America has not made anyone pay the price for that. And then when the worst tragedy occurred in American terms, when 239 American Marines were essentially killed in their sleep, murdered in their sleep, by Shiite fanatics allegedly controlled by Iran and Syria, America still has taken no retaliatory action. Now, Israelis that I talk to privately are just nonplussed. They just cannot understand how a great power does nothing with that kind of provocation, and always point to the fact that if something similar had happened to Israel, Israel would immediately make them pay 10 times over. So what is your attitude, and what is the attitude of Israelis generally, do you think, toward that kind of inaction on the part of the United States?
I think Israelis in general expect America to react with more aggressively and more determinedly against such provocations. I think Israelis in general tend to be hawkish and expect America to retaliate in the way that they would retaliate. But my personal opinion is that when you are a superpower and when you are a great power, there are more inhibitions and more limitations on your scope of retaliation, let's call it that, let's call it that, than when you are dealing with a small country. And I think this is a problem which plagues America and the democracies, that they are very limited in their capacity to react to acts of terrorism. By the way, the same is true about Israel too. We have never reacted the way you would expect a totally unlimited, uninhibited state to react to acts of terrorism. Very often we couldn't take retaliatory steps against the terrorists, and we have suffered and we have paid a very heavy price, both in Lebanon, along the northern frontier, and elsewhere. And it's not true that Israel always reacts with great determination and against acts of terrorism. Actually, we have just done something which is exactly the opposite. In order to get back 10 prisoners of war from the PLO, we have released 6,000 terrorists. Among them, 2 of the most vicious and diabolical murderers we have witnessed in our long story of bloodshed in this country. So to describe Israel as this omnipotent Prussia of the Middle East is totally wrong, is misleading.
When I talked to you a couple of years ago, you made 2 very interesting points, especially for a liberal, because you basically said that in your judgment, the situation had reached the point where Palestinian Arabs and Israelis could not really live together, and it was folly to think they could in peace. And also, you said, you mentioned a viewpoint which is usually mentioned by very strongly right-wing Israelis, the fact that the main issue has always been the adamant refusal of the Arab world to make peace or to agree even philosophically, morally, ethically to the existence of a Jewish state in this area. Has the last couple of years changed those opinions in any way?
Not really. I think, on the contrary, I think they've been
strengthened,
fortified and strengthened by events. Take, for instance, Camp David. Israel was ready to give up the whole of Sinai, despite its tremendous investment in that peninsula, in return for a paper peace, in return for recognition. Now, wasn't this the occasion for all the Arab countries, states, the PLO, Jordan, whatever, to join in on this bandwagon and say, okay, we want the same deal. We want peace in return for territory. And many Arab states and many observers didn't believe that after the murder of Sadat, President Sadat, Israel would stand by its word and keep its promise and evacuate the whole of Sinai. Israel did that, and despite that, peace with Egypt has become a dirty word in the Arab world, among Arab states, and also this circus called the UN. So in other words, this symbolizes more than anything else the refusal, the adamant refusal of the Arab world to come to terms with Israel, with any Jewish state.
Of any sort.
Of any sort.
Yeah,
and
this is why the right wing says that obviously the dispute is not over boundaries. It's not a question of giving them part of the West Bank and making them happy. So therefore, they conclude from that, why make any concessions?
Well, the difference between people like me and people in the Labour Party and people in Shinui, which is our party, and the right is that we think that things can change in the future. We think that there may be another Palestinian Sadat, as it were. We have seen this rejectionist Egypt under Nasser, and then we saw things change. And we want to keep our options open. We don't want to close any door to any possible change of heart on the part of Arab leaders. And we've seen some signs of greater realism within a moderate Arab camp. Now, another point is that we advocate this policy of open options because of internal problems too. We want to live in a unitary state which ensures full equal rights, full voting rights to any inhabitant, to any citizen. Now, if we are going to do that with regard to the over 1.5 million Arabs in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, we are going to lose our nature as a Jewish society, because you will have 30 to 40% members, Arab members, in this parliament, members who do not recognize our right to be here, who are hostile to the very idea of Israel and Zionism. That would be the most disruptive thing that could happen to Israel as a state, as a society, as a democracy.
Unless you just annex the land
and
not
just
the people.
Annex the land and not the people. That would mean that within Israel, we would have quite a lot of people who are disenfranchised, who do not have the vote. And that is contrary to everything that we stand for as Zionists, as Israelis, as Jews, as members of a democratic society. Because Israel has always rightly been proud of its democratic tradition. We've rightly been proud of the fact that despite this ongoing war and siege, we have clung to our democratic, human rights, civil liberties ideas. And I don't want to give it up. That is an internal issue. That has got something to do with the character of Israel, of the country and society that we want to live in. That's got nothing to do with attitude on the other side. And because of these two main reasons, we advocate a policy of non-annexation, of not creating facts, of not settling the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
So you would agree with at least one part of the Reagan plan. You're for a freeze on the settlements.
We are for a freeze on the settlements as the basis for some sort of negotiations with Jordan and with Palestinians who accept and recognize Israel on the basis of reciprocity. And though I think it is a mistaken policy to establish settlements in the West Bank, On the other hand, I would like to point out that the main responsibility for the absence of peace and the progress towards this peaceful settlement of the Middle East dispute lies with the Arabs and with the Palestinians, because they've got to say one thing. All they've got to say is, we would like to join this peace bandwagon. We would like to enter into negotiations with Israel. We would like to, instead of vilifying Egypt, we would like to join in with Egypt.
Well, the reality is, though, that as long as the thinking of the Begin government and now the Shamir government, that's really one of the basic tenets of the whole Likud coalition, the populating of the West Bank and the building settlements in Judea and Samaria. So obviously that's going to go on, and your party has 2 members out of 120 in the Knesset.
But Labour has 50 out of 100. I mean, we are almost half of the Knesset members. It's not a case where people who advocate this point of view are an insignificant minority. We are almost half of the Knesset.
So Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin basically would advocate a freeze on the settlements. It's the same policy.
Same policy with regard to the populated centers of the Arab centers of the West Bank and Judea and Samaria.
All right, so let's talk politics. Yes. Obviously, the only way that there's going to be a freeze on settlements is for the labor alignment, the leader of the labor alignment, to become the prime minister of the state of Israel. Do you see that happening?
Not necessarily. You must realize public opinion and political opinion in this country is naturally influenced by what goes on the other side. If you talk about a freeze on settlements as an academic, hypothetical issue, you don't get a majority. But if you had King Hussein following in Sadat's footsteps and saying, okay, let's sit down, discuss things, and you put in your share by having a freeze on settlement, public opinion in Israel would change overnight, as it did when Sadat uttered his famous words, no more war.
Well, I spoke with President Herzog this morning, and he pointed out that King Hussein has been very politically timid, and he doesn't see anything on the horizon that is necessarily going to all of a sudden give Hussein the courage to join. For example, he was invited to join the autonomy talks under Camp David. If he had joined, the 5-year transitional period would be just about over, and Israel and Jordan and Egypt would now be talking about perhaps permanent solutions in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. So, I mean, what leads you to be optimistic that Hussein is going to be the guy to represent the moderate Palestinians?
I'm not optimistic. On the contrary, if one lives in the Middle East, one has to learn to acquire pessimism as a way of life. All I'm saying is that, first of all, I'm blaming the Arabs, I'm blaming the Palestinians, and I'm blaming King Hussein for the absence of progress.
And you're also blaming them for the continuing policy of settlements.
I'm blaming them for the continuing policy of settlements, and they are going to miss a golden opportunity of reversing this tide. Because after all, you must realize, with all these settlements, there are about 25,000 Jews living in the West Bank. That, as things stand now, doesn't preclude a peaceful arrangement with Jordan. I mean, after all, we have got over 500,000 Israeli Arabs among our midst. So
in Israel proper.
In Israel proper. Now, I do not think that 25,000 or even 30,000 Jews in the West Bank are going to preclude a peaceful settlement.
Just as the Israelis in Yamit did not preclude the return of the entire Sinai.
Yes.
And who could have dreamed, reading Prime Minister Begin's works, his earlier works when he was out of power, that this man would ever, no matter what stage he ever reached, dismantle an existing Jewish settlement? But he did.
Exactly. He
did it.
Exactly. You must realize everything, almost everything, depends on Arab attitude to Israel. All we have had for over 30 years is a total rejection, a total ostracism of everything Israel stands for, of anything Israeli, of all things Israeli. Once we get a hint of a change of heart, everything changes within Israel. Before Sadat made his famous declaration, 99% of Israelis would have been against bartering Sinai for peace. Once he came to Jerusalem, public opinion and political opinion changed overnight. And as you say, it takes two to tango. you cannot discuss peace as an academic issue. You must have a partner. And if we had a partner with the Palestinians or with the Jordanians, things would change in this country. Even as things are, we almost have a majority in the Knesset, for our point of view, almost. We almost have 50%. If public opinion is to be changed, it must be done through some sort of dramatic step on the other side. And if King Hussein doesn't have the courage to do that, and the Palestinians do not have the courage to do that, it's going to be a great tragedy for all people concerned. It's going to be a great tragedy for the Middle East, but above all for themselves. And I think that historical experience proves that, first of all, you must never say never. You never know what's going to happen. That after Nasser, you may have a Sadat. And after Arafat, you may have somebody else. And after Hussein, you may have somebody who has more courage than Hussein. And you must leave your options open. And that if you want to keep everything, you may lose everything. That's what history proves in this part of the world, that compromise was a source of strength for Israel. That when we compromised in 1947 on the partitioning of Palestine, we could establish a Jewish state. And that when we compromised, we increased our foothold in this country. And that you must try and live in this country as a Jewish and democratic society. To me, this is the greatest danger of all, that I'm going to live in a Jewish society which doesn't give equal rights to all its members, regardless of race, religion, creed, whatever. This would be a Zionist heresy. This would be a heresy against everything on which we grew up.
But the 500 or 600 Arabs who live within the present borders of Israel, do they, in your judgment, as a lawyer and one who's been very interested in civil liberties, do those Arabs, the Israeli Arabs, have the kind of civil liberties and rights that you want them to have?
They have full political rights to begin with. They vote, they have their representatives here, and their representatives are occasionally very powerful.
In the Knesset?
In the Knesset. Their representatives, the Arab representatives, helped elect President Herzog, and without their votes, President Herzog would not have been elected. They play an important role in the political life of this country.
They're judges?
There are Arab judges, there are Arab civil servants, there used to be a deputy minister, and this under condition where you must realize we are not dealing with an ordinary majority-minority syndrome, where the minority belongs to a hostile majority. So I think Israel has a very good record on Arab civil liberties, despite the fact that I'm not happy with what goes on, and I think there's still room for improvement. But it's really incredible that actually under the Likud government there have been more public funds available for Arab development, for Arab education, and we've seen that within the space of 30-something years we have transformed an illiterate, rural, felachin, as we say, society into a society where there's almost universal education for boys and girls. So I think that the Israeli record with regard to Israeli Arabs is, though it leaves room for improvements, is quite impressive.
Let me ask you a philosophical question. It's always very, very interesting, and of course being in the state of Israel and supposedly everyone in power, or nearly everyone in power, is Jewish, why shouldn't there be tremendous cohesiveness politically? And obviously there are tremendous divisions within Israeli society. But in the American context, something very interesting. You'll turn on television, cable television, and you will hear some of these evangelical Christians, and there are millions of them in the United States, many more evangelical Christians than Jews in the United States. And they will talk about the state of Israel, about the Jews' inalienable biblical right to all of the Holy Land. They will say unashamedly and unembarrassedly that God blesses those who bless the Jewish people, and they see the modern state of Israel as the culmination of biblical prophecy. And then you turn on a Jewish television station, and the Jews can always see the other side, the Palestinian side, the Arab side, the 4 or 5 sides of the question. Do you have any explanation for that kind of dilemma?
You see, Jews are funny people. They can be very exasperating, and They can be fascinating. On the whole, they are generally talented. But they've got one thing above all which I find redeeming. Redeeming is the right word, which I find very positive, and with which I associate wholeheartedly. It's the fact that they can see the other side, that they've never had this total egocentricity which has engulfed and which has plagued modern society. And they've been famous for that, especially since the 19th century. They could always associate with other people, they could write about other people, they could write French music which was more French than the French themselves wrote. They could identify wholeheartedly with modern Germany. And this sort of characteristics, this sort of phenomenon had two different manifestations. One was assimilation, their readiness to assimilate among the Gentiles of the earth, to give up almost everything. And that was the phenomenon that we saw in pre-Nazi Germany. On the other hand, this same characteristic gave rise to a sense of empathy for other people, for other minorities, for lost causes, for the oppressed, for the persecuted. And this is an old Jewish tradition, that you must always think about the stranger and the foreigner among you because you were slaves under Pharaoh's Egypt. That's part of the scripture, that's part of the Haggadah in Passover, that's part of our national psyche. And Zionism was very Jewish in this sense. It wasn't Jewish in many respects, it was actually non-Jewish in many respects. It wanted to transform the Jews into something that they had not been in the past. But Zionism was Jewish in this one sense, that they wanted to perpetuate this Jewish tradition.
Well, of course, one of the great paradoxes of the founding of the modern state of Israel, in a sense, is that the original Zionists, the labor Zionists, were not really religious people, terribly religious people. And yet, on the other hand, there's this Orthodox segment of the Jewish community that has a completely different attitude about Judea and Samaria, not so much in the sense of security and defense, but in our God-given right. God gave this land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, and the Jews simply do not have the right to return it, or any portion of it. The Sinai was different. That was not part of the Promised Land.
Not all religious Jews believe that. I think the majority of religious Jews in this country believe that. But many religious sages and rabbis in this country, and especially in the diaspora, do not share this philosophy. Most Israelis would say, yes, of course we have the right to the land. We fought for it, and we've developed it, and this is our only homeland. The Arabs have other homelands. But on the other hand, the great majority of Israelis are going to compromise, are going to make a compromise, to give up part of this right in order to live peacefully with their neighbors. So to describe the situation in this country as totally hopeless, as a case where the extremists of both sides, the fanatic Arabs and the fanatic Jews, have the upper hand, is tempting. It's tempting to describe it this way, but I don't think this would be accurate. I think that there is a chance for peace, and we must hold on to it, because the alternative is much worse.
Thank you very much.